butterflies. They can be tiny, they can be gigantic, they can be beautiful, or sometimes weird. Altogether, though, they can change the world. Now, modern science folklore would have us believe that the flap of a butterfly's wing in one part of the world might stir up a hurricane in another part. Well, with 10 billion butterflies flapping around at any one time, you'd think we'd be in a constant storm. But for the most part, all that flapping, it's only relevant to the butterfly and its immediate environment. Yet, long ago in the history of science, one young man was inspired by butterflies to travel the world, and then to change it. This man was Alfred Russel Wallace. In the mid-19th century, young Wallace was living in the beautiful mountainous British nation called Wales. Wallace was a man of modest means and couldn't afford to go to college. Alfred's older brother took him on as an apprentice mapmaker. Wallace's keen technical mind saw him learn the trade very quickly, but what he most liked about mapmaking was that it encouraged him to roam widely in the wild hills of Wales. In the weekends, Wallace would grab a guidebook and set across the highlands, seeking out interesting creatures, birds, bugs, beetles, and butterflies. Within a few years, he'd become an expert collector, carefully drawing his creaturely discoveries, then writing them up into scientific reports. However, not everything about map-making in Wales was wonderful. Wallace's employers were usually wealthy landlords who hired him to map their estates to determine how much their tenant farmers owed them in rent or taxes. Sometimes Wallace himself was sent to collect these rents and taxes from the tenants, who were often very poor and their homes sometimes pitiable and decrepit. Wallace felt sick inside for being part of the process that stole money from poor landless farmers before handing it over to rich landed gentry. So much so that he often sought escape out of the foul business. In the end, Wallace took the plunge to become a full-time naturalist, gathering creatures from the wild to sell them on to museums and collectors. Though the highlands of Wales had proved a great training ground, Wallace's deep desire was to explore the tropics, where flamboyant critters flapped, crawled, and buzzed in a magnificent splendor. To that end, in 1848, Wallace boarded a ship, the Mischief, to take him far across the Atlantic Ocean to South America. Dropping him off near the mouth of the mighty Amazon River. Wallace paddled for thousands of miles along the waterways of the Amazon, wading through wetlands, dodging vicious piranha, scaling muddy banks, hacking through undergrowth, climbing viney trees, traversing precipitous ranges, day in, day out for years, all with a diverse array of collecting equipment and notebooks. Gradually, Wallace amassed an impressive treasury of exotic creatures, some for his own investigations, but just as many to ship back to Britain to be sold. In 1852, Wallace assembled his precious Amazon insects into cases and chests and loaded them aboard a ship bound for his homeland. One still morning, far out to sea, tiny whiffs of smoke began curling up from the ship's cargo hold. Acting in haste, the crew threw open the cargo hatch, thus feeding the smoldering stowage with a huge waft of air. Within minutes, a raging fire was leaping onto all decks. The captain ordered all aboard to abandon the vessel. From the confines of a lifeboat, Wallace watched his prized collection go up in smoke as well. And Wallace's heart, it soon sunk, like the burning ship. For days and days, Wallace and the crew floated in the Atlantic, growing ever thirstier and ever hungrier. Just when they began to lose all hope, a passing ship plucked them out of the water, and they sailed onward to Britain. When Wallace stepped ashore, he vowed never to go to sea again. Wallace didn't sulk for long after his Atlantic disaster, though. In 1854, he boarded another ship, this time bound for the steamy Malay archipelago in Southeast Asia. Having learned his lesson from the Amazon fiasco, Wallace sent specimens home in small batches, just in case disaster struck again. He also mailed reports bursting with new scientific theories that got him published in the scientific press. However, his agent in London was constantly whining to him, "Forget theory, Alfred. It is the collecting that pays the bills." But Wallace's mind wasn't about to sit still. One idea that captured Wallace's imagination was the transformation of species, or evolution, which was hinted at by fossils displayed in the museums of the period. But as of yet, in the mid-19th century, the idea of evolution was thought pretty wacky by most scientists, since no one had come up with a compelling theory explaining how or why creatures would evolve. One day, whilst chasing butterflies on a small island near Sulawesi, Wallace caught some kind of jungle fever instead. Resting in bed, sweating and delirious, Wallace dreamed of the teeming tropical wilderness around him. Half asleep, a series of strange thoughts washed through his mind. Wallace noted, "It ain't easy to survive in the tropical jungle as a butterfly, that's for sure. Life is a constant battle. Yet those butterflies with freaky eye spots, they probably scare away most of the birds that want to eat them. Indeed, the freakier the spots, the higher the chance to survive, and then have more offspring." Wallace mused to himself that maybe this accidental survival trick would lead to butterflies growing ever freakier eye spots as each generation builds on this useful trait. Wallace suddenly realized this was it. This was the hidden mechanism of biological transformation, the driving force of evolution. Nature is red in tooth and claw, and only those fit enough, or adaptable enough, may survive. He scribbled down his idea and mailed it to a British naturalist called Charles Darwin. Darwin was very impressed, but then he had been mulling upon the same idea for years. Together, they published their theory as a joint article, and it hit 19th century Britain like a ton of bricks. By the time Wallace steamed back to London in 1862, the theory was the talk of the town. Scientists loved it for the most part, but some others, not so much. The theory implied humans weren't divine creations but glorified monkeys. And the Earth? Not a few thousand years old, but many, many millions. Many churchmen felt evolution scurrilous, since there was no mention of it in the Bible. About the same time, quite a few British elite, as well as fans of British imperialism, twisted evolutionary theory to justify their privilege and imperial dominance, arguing that the British upper class were the fittest of the fit and destined to dominate the globe. Wallace said of this, "It's utter nonsense." Wallace chaffed the aristocracy for lacking evolutionary fitness to rule anybody, since it was merely their inherited privilege, not their physical or intellectual traits, that sustained their power. If the lord of this estate here took on a real jungle, he'd be chewed up by a wee swamp cat within half an hour. Also, in his write-up about his travels in the Malay archipelago, he praised the villagers of Sulawesi as more civilized than the snooty elite of his homeland. This was shocking stuff for Victorian sensibilities. Despite rocking the boat in Britain, Wallace's fame soared worldwide. Universities in America begged him to give lectures there. He hesitated at first, since the last time he toured the Americas, his boat went up in smoke, then sunk. but Wallace was keen to see the natural wonders of North America and even got an invite to meet President Grover Cleveland. Most of the time, Wallace's fans wanted to hear about evolution and to see his illustrations of weird creatures and strange lands. Since these subjects were to his liking as well, this is what he lectured about. However, his writings were somewhat different, full of biting social critique. About New York, he wrote of his disgust at viewing so many terrible slums in such a prosperous city. About Nevada, he wrote how mining companies abused their laborers and laid waste to the landscape. He also blasted colonial greed in both the Americas and Asia, since it wrecked forests and woodlands and stomped over indigenous communities whose deep ties to nature and land he admired. Wallace also wrote of the poor farmers he had dealt with in Wales. Some of them were so destitute they went hungry and their kids without schooling, a national shame given Britain's claim to be the most advanced realm in the world. Wallace suggested the best solution to rural poverty lay with the nationalization of all farmlands. Entrusted to the state, the farming rights could then be dispersed fairly amongst the entire national community of farmers. Because of his stature in the world of science, these wild scribblings about social justice were given great regard by numerous social reformers and political agitators. Wallace was often asked whether the constant struggle in nature meant human groups were forever destined to battle each other. His answer was that humans could easily outwit evolutionary forces just by cooperating and making joint plans in a fair and democratic way. So for Wallace, changes don't come with one flap of a single butterfly's wing. They come with 1,000,000 flaps, and everyone has to flap together. Alfred Russel Wallace was a remarkable scientist, giving us deep new knowledge of the world's living creatures. Yet he also gave the world something more. Great social ideas to help keep us all flapping